difficult subject. To be interesting to hear how people talk about it without being offensive or causing offence.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Kamal Munir and I'm privileged to be moderating a very important conversation tonight on Black Lives Matter. Has anything really changed? Last year, triggered by the violent deaths of African Americans at the hands of the police, the slogan Black Lives Matter gained significant traction. It reached fever pitch after the brutal killing of George Floyd, especially. Here in the UK, many came out on the streets to express their anger at the persistent persecution of and discrimination against Black people. They organized to protest not just police brutality, but also instances of systemic racism that prevented Black people from achieving their potential in society. As someone who studies business and organizations personally, I've never seen so many corporations under pressure to look inwards and explain why so little diversity existed in their top echelons. New diversity initiatives started as a result, and PR departments got busy churning out statements in support of diversity. A year on, it seems like a good time to ask if anything has really changed. And to discuss this, we have a stellar panel with us today. But before I introduce the panel, a word about how to ask questions. You're all watching it on YouTube. And if you have any questions, use the code under the video. The code is A093. Use it for questions for the panelists. So on my panel today, Kahinde Andrews is a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. He has several books to his name. The latest published this year is The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. Kahinde is co-chair of the Black Studies Association. Then we have Dr. Monica Moreno Figueroa, who's associate professor in sociology at Cambridge, where she also has the role of University Race Equality Champion. She co-leads the Decolonize Sociology Committee and runs the End Everyday Racism project that monitors racism in higher education. And we have Dr. Ali Meghji, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology as well at Cambridge. He's also co-chair of the department's Decolonizing Sociology Committee and has published various books, including Critical Race Theory, A Reintroduction and Decolonizing Sociology. Dr. Pragya Agarwal is a behavioral scientist, author, and consultant. Pragya is the author of several books, including Sway, Unraveling Unconscious Bias, and speaks regularly on bias, anti-racism, social inclusion, power, and privilege. So delighted to welcome you all on a day that Number 10 has announced that Britain doesn't really have the problem of institutional racism. So not sure what we are all doing here, but let us pretend that there is a problem out there and BLM was trying to actually change something. Has it succeeded? Try to answer very briefly, please, certainly no more than 5 minutes so that we can follow up with questions. And would be great if you can start out with a yes or no to the question before elaborating. Before you respond, however, since we are on the topic of whether anything has changed, I want to proudly point out one thing that seems to have changed. At my college, Homerton, we appointed a new principal today, Simon Woolley, who becomes the first male Black head of a college in 800 years of Oxbridge. So very excited about that, but back to my question. Has anything changed? Shall we start with you, Kahinde?
Well, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for being here. Yes, apparently everything's changed. I just found out today that there is no institutional racism. The real problem is what poor white people, and we just need to move on. Like I'm happy. Look, we're here, so I guess we can end this conversation. But I mean, I guess less than glibly, something has changed, and this has not changed for the better. In fact, it's changed for the worse, and quite significantly. And I think this report is the perfect example of that. So what happened over the summer is there was a moment. Okay, I wasn't optimistic because I never get optimistic, just as a ontological point. But there was a moment of optimism. There was like a real focus. There was different discussions about race and ethnicity. As you said, there was, I got invited to talk to all these massive companies about race for the first time. It's like, okay, so maybe it's a bit different. There was a run on books. All the anti-racist books were sold out on Amazon. So there was certainly a different level of conversation. But that's done. I mean, that is gone. And in fact, why I say it's got worse is because the backlash to that has been swift, and we're now actually in a worse position on this issue than we were prior to the eruption and protest in the first place. Because the backlash has been severe. I mean, it was very quickly that we weren't talking about defunding the police anymore. We were talking about whether Rule Britannia should be sung at the proms. Like, we just got into this culture war debate so quickly. And this government is the most diverse government in history. Is also the most racist government certainly in my history. And those two things aren't coincidental. And what's happened, and what's really been the really only big change you've had structurally in terms of race, is that there were concessions made so that there is now some more representation in the professional middle. I mean, look how many of us are here, right? Like professor this, that. Go back 20 years, forget about it. In fact, now it's pretty unlikely, but 20 years ago, completely wouldn't have happened. So there's, for some of us have managed to get into positions, and there's more influence, and we have a diverse government, etc. But that was a real bad strategy, thinking about trying to get change. And also, you see, that doesn't actually mean that anything's changed. And in fact, what's happening now, particularly with this government and this report, is that those black and brown faces in those high places are now actually being used to legitimize racist policy. Like this report is as part of the government's wider agenda of saying there's no racism, and they've now went and got some institutional racism deniers to now deny there's institutional racism. And the way it's being reported, I had to correct the tweet that was on TV today. Landmark report shows that there's no institutional racism in Britain, and that is frankly ridiculous. This is a report put together by people who have no credibility, background. And if you look at the report, it's so badly done. But this just shows you the purpose of it is actually to support this really right-wing racist agenda on the government, and that is new in the UK, at least, having black and brown faces being so important. It's not new generally. In fact, Empire always needed black and brown faces. There were more Indians in the British Army than there were British people, right? Maintaining colonialism in India. So that's not a new feature, but it is a new feature at the moment that we're in now, and I think a particularly insidious one. And I just wanted to pick out one quote from the report. This is how bad it was. This is more just about the report. But one of the recommendations is that we need to use data in a responsible and informed way to make sure that to reduce the opportunity for misunderstanding and misuse, which I just found hilarious, given the way the data has been misused and abused and distorted beyond all relevance. But that is unfortunately the moment that we're in, when we're now in a position where we're again having to justify whether racism exists. At least, I don't know, 20 years ago, if you compare to the McPherson report, there was just the exception that there was institutional racism. And actually now we've gone backwards. So actually I think things have changed and they got worse.
Wow. Thanks, Kahinde. Yeah, that's quite stark. Let's come to you, Ali. And what do you think? I mean, because Kahinde has raised all kinds of questions. And, I'm thinking, where does the movement stand today? And, what were the actual goals? All movements have some goals. But anyway, so over to you. What do you think?
Bless you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm probably going to add to Kahinde's pessimism to the extent of I think that if things have changed, they probably have changed for the worse. So, but before I go into that, I will just do at least like 1 minute of maybe some kind of positivity that we can take out of this. So, what we did see after the murder of George Floyd was that there were anti-racist protests, not just in the US, not just in the UK, but across the whole world, right? And what you saw in those were that, demonstrations in France connected Floyd's death with their own state violence against post-colonial citizens. Protesters in Kenya connected it to their own problem with police brutality, legitimized through the Public Order Act, which was actually created by the British colonial government. Portuguese protesters carried cards saying racism with colonial heritage. Indigenous groups in New Zealand drew parallels between police violence in the States with hyper-incarceration of the Maori people. And in Belgium, South Africa, and Britain and elsewhere, you see statues of colonial figures such as Edward Colston, Cecil Rhodes, and King Leopold II all being brought down. Right, so to an extent, we can see how this murder of George Floyd acted as a catalyst for potential coalitions to be built between many different anti-racist, anti-imperial movements across the world. And really importantly, all of these movements saw the interconnections between what they were struggling against. So for them, racism in the US was not just simply racism in the US, but it was seen as a component part of a world order founded on the principles of racism and coloniality. So to this extent, the positivity to take is that these movements basically showed a connection with previous anti-racist, anti-colonial movements, those kind of anti-racist movements that Kahinde was speaking about in terms of the positive ones, right?
Yeah.
Ranging from Du Bois's critique of the global color line, the so-called defining problem of the 20th century.
I talked to somebody about this, like a friend of mine about this recently, and it's like, might even have been you. But my background isn't so great. Like, the police were at my house every weekend and often midweek, every weekend for at least 3 years to come and speak to my mum about my brother and arrest my brother and then take him down to the police station. And regularly midweek, you know, at 2 in the morning, my mum would get woken up by the police and she would have to wake me up and take me with her to the police station to get my brother. So, you know, school was a bit fucked because of that. And up until I was at least 16, 17, I would say that if you're a kid of my equivalent age from African or British Jamaican background or something like that, African background, you would almost certainly have, it would have been comparable. Like the amount I got stopped and searched by police in the street when I went into town because they knew who my brother was. Like, it was every time I went into town, pretty much, and it meant that I just stopped going into town in the end until I was a bit older. But most of that stopped by the time I sort of turned 16, 17. Most of the police that I'd known had moved out of the area or knew my brother had moved out of the area. And with one exceptional incident when I attended a police lineup as one of the extras, not as the accused, as one of the extras that they have in. They pay you for that. A police inspector looked at my name and went, Jamie Crawford, don't suppose your brother's name is Gemmell, is it? Which is my brother's name. Being so unique, it really stands out. And, you know, that was probably the last instant where it was. But I've spoken to quite a few of my black mates that I grew up with. Less so my Asian friends, but certainly my mates who've got like African or West Indian descent, they will tell me that shit's still been going on since they left. So for me, it kind of stopped once I became an adult, but for them, it still goes on. So the ones that have got nice jobs and so therefore nice cars do regularly still get stopped, even though they haven't done anything. You know, a couple of them never did it. One of them is a prosecutor, you know, for the CPS. And she'll get stopped occasionally. Not often. As a woman, she's less of a threat, I suppose. But yeah, so. But class is a big one. Definitely. Because to be honest with you, if your family are known as toe rags, doesn't matter what fucking age you are. Doesn't matter doesn't matter what skin colour you are. If your family are known as toe rags, they're just gonna fucking be on you. And at that point, skin colour really doesn't matter. But the problem is there's a lot of people who aren't toe rags who still have to put up with that shit anyway. Anyway, sorry, my 2 penny worth.
You know, the more recent emergence of the Zapatistas in Mexico and their attempt to create a world in which many worlds fit. These are all kind of groups bound around a practice to basically find those inherent connections between inequalities all across the world in virtue of how they were forged through coloniality and white supremacy. However, the thing that I want to focus on is the kind of pessimistic.
That is a very accurate thing to say. I would agree with that. Which is kind of what my story there was about. It's like, for me, it would be very easy for me to say, hey, look, you know, like, certainly until I was 16, it was the same for me all the time. I was always being stopped in the town, which is the same as, you know, would be said for, you know, a young black kid in 14, 15 in the city of London at the moment because of all knife crime. But saying that, it's because my brother, you know, my brother was a literal criminal whirlwind for 3 years. Like, he ended up going to naughty boys school to secure unit for 90 days. And then had to go and live with my dad because my mum just couldn't handle him anymore. So, you know, it definitely was a thing. But as I say, like, once my prof wasn't in the sphere of influence, and so therefore I wasn't doing anything wrong either. The police were very, you know, as I say, by the time of adulthood, gone. So that's a realisation, isn't it? You know, that I've benefited there.
The side which shows that things have changed potentially.
Can
for the
also,
worse.
I suppose, depend on what you
because
got known for when you were a kid.
Whilst that kind of year of protest in 2020 carrying on into 2021, whilst they showed that there were transnational solidarities, what we've also seen is transnational resistance to the anti-racist movements, right? So this is where I want to reflect on how things haven't really changed that much for the better. So if the world...
I mean, it will also do with the laws. So there are laws that we have that structurally, in a structural way, are kind of racist. A lot of the drugs laws, for example, are. For a variety of reasons, there are people who are non-white who might use cannabis, and those are actually genuine religious reasons. For example, well, not genuine, but like, because obviously I don't believe in religion, but they're genuine reasons that, you know, it's not them like, you know, we're all getting fucked. It's like part of a religious ceremony, much like we might use like frankincense in the Catholic Church in the old things. But
system is dictated by what we would term as the colonial matrix of power or white supremacy or whatever, then we have to realize that because it's such a totalizing structure, it has the ability to both absorb critique and also insulate itself from change. And while, you know, in my own work, I do think about this in a global way, I think we can just use examples at a national level to think about this dual process of absorbing and insulating from critique and how that becomes articulated in particular national structures. So in the US, for instance, it wasn't that long after the protest began that you got this much wider attack at a governmental level on critical theorizing around race. So, for example, Donald Trump, in one of his executive orders, banned the teaching of critical race theory in public institutions, right? And you also saw death threats to those who were willing to speak out against this attack on free speech, such as those that we're seeing recently with Bena Hesse. And in the UK, you see something really similar. The protests were themselves used to justify a series of measures, all of which effectively insulated the state from any kind of critique. This involved a range of mechanisms, from Boris Johnson whipping up a culture war that Kahinde referenced in claiming that Britons needed to stop their wet self-recrimination and start adopting a positive view towards Britain's past. We have the Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, claiming that the government stands unequivocally against the teaching of critical race theory, labeling Black Lives Matter protesters as militant Marxists. Liz Truss came up with a levelling up agenda in which she claimed that we need to move away from the fashionable topic of race when we're thinking about social policy. And the culture minister, Oliver Dowden, created a summit with large heritage bodies to protect Britain's past from critical investigation. So in other words, what we've seen is essentially that the state took these protests against something that happened in Minneapolis and used it as a justification to further legitimize the very social forces which those in Britain and elsewhere were struggling against. And you see that also, for example, in measures to actually further restrict the ability to even protest in the first place under Priti Patel's new legislation. So this is how, to come back to also what Kahinde was referring to, this is how we've got to a stage where today we're told there's no evidence of institutional racism in the UK, despite the fact that, for example, 60% of Bangladeshi young children and 50% of Pakistani and Black children are living in poverty in the UK. But apparently there's no institutional racism, right? Young Black people are now 9 times more likely in the UK to be in youth custody than young white people. But once again, there's no institutional racism, right? There's no evidence of it. So I want to conclude by essentially saying, yes, things have changed to the extent that we have seen some kind of engagement with already existing movements which connect struggles transnationally. But yes, they've also changed for the worse to the extent that the backlash has kind of outweighed any kind of gains that were made through those solidarities that were formed.
Well,
right,
yeah, because
right. Thanks,
to do
Ali.
so would
so both
be
Kahinde and you sort of think this backlash has been severe
for a bunch of people who
and
think
very,
they're not
very
racist to
potent.
admit that they
Monica,
are
what
a little
about
bit,
you? Do you agree or?
you know?
Yeah, I think it'd be, well, I mean, we could start by saying, yeah, there is a big backlash, and it's quite interesting that it's happening precisely today. I mean, these days where the murder of George Floyd is being discussed in the US, and where many other examples are coming to us, continue to appear. And I think if I start with something like positive that I could say, well, what has changed? We could think about
Like,
a
we are
lot
better
of like
than a lot
Black
of countries.
female
I'm not
leadership
saying
that
that
is
we're
coming across,
shit,
indigenous
you know.
female leadership as well in anti-racist work.
I don't believe we're
there
that
is,
shit. We're definitely
I
better
think
than
we could
America,
fairly say that the attention to
100%
racism and
better,
anti-racism that we are seeing
at least.
all over the world is quite remarkable, like unprecedented in the same in the
There
level
is
of
huge discrepancies
yeah, we can
that
say the
make no
level of
sense.
attention. However, these
It's a bit
as I've
a
seen in
black
my
woman
own
is
work in
sometimes
terms of
more
Latin
likely
American
to
anti-racism,
die
the
in
turn to
childbirth,
racism and anti-racism,
and is something like 10
what
times more
allows us
likely
to
to be
see is that
refused
the ways that
pain
people are understanding racism are quite
management
diverse,
drugs.
and that the anti-racism that
In
we're
this
seeing
country, this is not
generated
America, you know.
in
Like,
many
so why
spaces
is
like
that?
this one. I mean, this report today, it's a form of anti-racism. You see, it's an example of that kind of anti-racist
If people
work
can
that
explain
is
to me
kind of
why,
worse
if
than
people can put
nothing
me a
sometimes,
better
so that
reason
it would be
other
better
than
not to
there's something
actually
going on.
have come across. Because what
Even
we
if it's
have is a reduction and a
unconscious bias,
manipulation of
which is a
what
complicated thing to deal
racism
with, but
is,
learning about it means that you help
reducing
deal
it
with it.
to attitudes, to behavior, to simply microaggressions, and not understanding that microaggressions are the expression of wider phenomena. As it's very interesting, like reminding what Sarah Ahmed said when she was discussing institutional racism, of how it is not a failure. Institutional racism is not a failure of institutions. On the contrary, is an orchestrated, positive, organized action that says what we have today. Racism does not exist. It's not that important. We're not going to do this. We're not going to act. We're not going to perceive racism in this particular way or the other. So it's a manipulation, a gaslighting. People are talking about that, a gaslighting of that phenomena. In places where, I mean, if we move a little bit outside the UK to other contexts where there are different racial projects, like in Latin America, for example, where there's another understanding of mixture, of where mixture is the basic understanding of race. What we see there is that there is an attention emerging, there's a discourse emerging, and we can actually see it almost much more even naive or fragile, this refusal and this gaslighting and this delegitimation. And even in those contexts, I mean, 2 days ago, a Salvadorian woman called Victoria Salazar was murdered in the same way by a policeman breaking her neck, kneeling on her
I would say it'd be
in
treated
Mexico.
worse.
And we have the
Well,
exact
this is why you
same
have to do
parallel.
better.
The issue is that in a
Because
context
you have
like
to be
Mexico,
better
they
than
would
that.
be saying, or there are some
In general,
discussions
as a
about
rule,
a clarity of
I
connecting the
think
two cases and
that you should
insisting
just be
on
better than that.
the gravity of institutional
I think we could be better than that.
racism throughout policing systems.
So
And at the same time, there would be others that
that's why
re-victimize,
things
that
like
put the blame on the victim and say, well, what
positive
was she doing there? What was
discrimination
she?
can be a good
Which
thing.
is a parallel of what we're seeing
It
with this
depends on why
report.
you're doing
It
it
is
and how
about
you
what he's saying. It
implement
is
it.
about young Black
A
people
lot of people
doing
would
the
hate that
work
idea, but
themselves, or
I
it's
don't have a
about their
problem with it.
families, the ones that are to blame, etc. So I think these parallels are very interesting, and I would be very worried about the anti-racisms that we're seeing flourishing at this time. And I think we should be careful of thinking that just the label anti-racism says something very clear and significant. I think it has to be mediated, and we need to understand what is behind that. So I think that's all there.
Okay, thank you. Pragya.
Yeah, what can I add? I mean, I think there's been a lot said already. So I could start with saying yes and no, like everybody else. Yes, the kind of international impact of Black Lives Matter, the protests that happened, cannot be dismissed. Yes, it for the first time, maybe it wasn't the first time that we were seeing racism or talking about it, but for the first time, maybe people were willing to have a conversation about other forms of racism, not just the explicit hate crimes or explicit forms of racism that can often be acknowledged. People were willing to talk about more subversive forms of racism as well, that is deeply embedded in our society, that creates these kind of discriminatory barriers for people. In my work, I mean, I saw a willingness from a number of organizations in the last few months to engage with these conversations, to actually look inwards, not just talk about diversity, but more often talk about inclusivity and how they can create more inclusive environments and not just create a kind of a performative thing where they're ticking boxes. Yes, that is happening and that has happened. But of course, as everybody has said, there's been a backlash, there's been a resistance, because we have to understand that even the work of anti-racism is embedded within our society, where the dominant narrative, and we have to think about who is designing the dominant narrative, who is actually able to create this narrative. And I suppose that has really made it people aware, or made actually really brought it in stark contrast as to what the notion of power and privilege, and who holds power in this society, about who has the power to create these narratives, who has the power to create policies that that demonstrate that they're doing the anti-racism work, but it's actually not anti-racism in itself. And so, for instance, the report today, it's been really kind of shocking, but not shocking in a way, because a system that's got racism embedded in it, in its processes, and it's in the system itself, when it comes back and says there's no racism, it's kind of a circular narrative fallacy, because it's saying the racist system is saying there's no racism. And often that's what happens with a lot of organizations that I've been working with as well. Also, I think when we talk about institutional racism and systemic racism, what has also become quite important to discuss through Black Lives Matter protest and in the last year is to talk about the interrelationship between individual, interpersonal, systemic, and institutional racism, and how they feed off each other and how they perpetuate each other, and that we cannot just talk about one or the other. We can't just talk about individual and interpersonal aspects like microaggressions, or just institutional and systemic and structural barriers. So I think the notion of power and privilege has been really been brought into focus in the last year, but especially with this report. And what really stood out with me with this report is that they are dismissing any forms of bias, or dismissing any forms of kind of that we need to look at prejudice. They dismiss the notion of white privilege, which is really not very surprising because there's been a lot of discussion going on. But they're using it to say that actually the white privilege doesn't exist. There's no notion of white privilege, but there is a notion of affinity bias, which means that people are more related to are more likely to relate to people who are like us. So then using the notion of bias, which they're dismissing, to actually counter racism, which seems like a really bizarre argument. And so from what I've seen with the report, the notion of confirmation bias has really become, has been highlighted because they're just picking up, cherry picking facts to support what they actually still already believe in. So as Kahinde says, it's probably one of the most racist comments. And as everybody said, I think this report has really highlighted that even though we were talking more about it, nothing much has really changed on the ground.
Right. Thank you, Pragya. So there are lots of people, hundreds of people who are watching you right now, and I'm sure many of them are thinking, so where's the hope, guys? Because yes, movements are mobilizations, right? But then there are counter mobilizations, and movements just have to deal with that. So it doesn't have to end with a backlash. Movements can respond. So where do you see this movement? How do you assess it? How do you evaluate it? Where is its does it have the capability to actually respond and strengthen? So can I come back to you, Kahinde, on this?
I actually think that is one of the positive things about this report, because I think that there's been a lot. If you think about the mobilizations in the 60s, 70s, they really do lead to the Race Relations Acts. They lead to trying to reform the system. They lead us to this point, really. And I think previously we had faith that in these institutions and maybe something can change. But this is so brazenly ridiculous that I think we can see through it. And I think actually that's one thing generally, if you look at the protests last year, this is a group of young people who've been raised on the dream that we can reform this system. And any evidence that shows that's nonsense has to be a good thing, because then it gets us thinking that we have to do something else. And so I think actually this is actually probably better in the long run than the McPherson report, because the McPherson report gives you hope that it's being taken serious. At least we can just dash it out and say, "No, look, we can't rely on the government. Let's do the work that needs to be done." So on that side, I think it's probably a positive thing for the movement.
Right. So let me ask Ali. I mean, so Kahinde said, maybe people are now realizing, or movement members are realizing, that something else needs to be done. What is that something else that needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Kahinde's optimism that this report lays bare the fact that, this is not being taken seriously, as you said, right? That actually there's a lack of understanding. There's a complete lack of understanding of what it even means to talk about racism. And so it shows that you can't rely on the state to be the primary institution that's going to create any positive change. But my pessimism remains to the extent of exactly what we need to do now is similar to what people were saying that we need to do hundreds of years ago, right? Even all the way back to the very creation of race itself. I mean, to think about the protests last year in a way, it led to kind of like actual popular discourses around abolition, which was quite new in lots of mainstream media outlets. But, the concept of abolition was also talked about by Du Bois at the beginning of the 20th century when he was talking about abolition democracy. So it just seems like, for me, there's just these recurrent conversations and these sparks where you think that something might happen. But as I said, these sparks tend to be absorbed, and then the status quo remains. And it comes back to what Kahinde said. You get really slight concessions. So you might get a Race Relations Act like you got in the UK, but that's then coupled with maintaining the racial status quo, because let's not forget that each of those Race Relations Acts were followed directly by immigration acts that stopped Black and brown people from coming into the UK. So my pessimism slightly remains, unfortunately.
I can see that, Ali. Yes, and so maybe Monica and Pragya can bring in some hope here. Who wants to go first?
Pragya, you want to go first?
In terms of optimism, I think we have to remain optimistic. Because if not optimism, then what actually? Again, as I said, it is at least this wider discourse happening. I mean, look at us, we're talking about it. And there's more discourse happening in media, although we keep talking again and again, and finally it has to come to some action eventually. But yes, I think the more we talk about it, the more discourse happens, the more openness there is about these conversations. Maybe I don't know what will change. I mean, it's quite, again, it's very difficult to say how we can really change things, but I have seen a willingness for people to change on an individual level, on an institutional level, and I suppose that little bits can create a momentum. I suppose we need to think about, as a society, what that would look like. Even, I mean, I don't think we really know what a post-racial society would look like yet, so we need to maybe have a conversation about what is our idealized vision, what would we like to see happen as well.
That's what I'm trying to ask you guys. What is the goal here of the movement, and what are we trying to achieve, and what will it take to achieve that? So maybe Monica has the answer.
Well, what I think it will, I mean, I don't know what it will take generally, but one idea that I think can add to the discussion is that we need to think of new ways of communicating what the issues are. I mean, we're clearly not being listened very well, or things are not coming through, or are being misused. And I think it's, if we take it, with a relaxed approach, that we have a lot of work on and we want to do this work because we're committed to wanting a better society. So I think finding ways in which we can be heard is important. I think that passes through reimagining the figure of the activist, of ourselves as activists, or any academic activists or other activists, because I feel it's somehow exhausted, the figure of the activist. And that has been in some ways co-opted, in some ways mistreated, in some ways misused, and or depleted. Somehow we've been using a very particular way of entering these debates, and I think that it's an opportunity maybe to refashion it. I don't mean by this that we shouldn't protest, or we shouldn't interrupt racism, or we shouldn't go out and claim and demand. It's just, how can we do it? What else can we do? What we haven't done that we need to try now, even if it's totally scary or totally weird. Something I'm very concerned about is how we have also opened somehow a situation where there is a big clash between certain groups or certain environment within activism that has a lot of resentment. And I think maybe for a reason, but that resentment seems to be guiding the work, or some of the work. And that is encountering a lot of defensiveness. And that is just keeping us stuck. We're just stuck in that thing of, we're gonna, tell you all the things we're aggravated about. And we have all these other groups telling us we're gonna defend our position, whatever it takes, right? So that I just think is not productive anymore.
Okay.
I feel that we have to not encourage a discourse where we are not willing to engage in finding new ways of doing this work. It's an opportunity, and I see it with at the same time that I'm exhausted and I'm sometimes completely depleted about doing this work, I'm also thinking, okay, how can we do it better? With who we have to be working? Who are the subjects that are going to be leading this in much more productive ways? I mean, where are we getting stuck? And we just need to try out things we haven't tried before, which we are set to imagine. Yeah.
Thanks, Monica. Pragya, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and I think that's a really good point that Monica has made about the nature of activism and how that has been maybe co-opted, or maybe we need to reconsider and re-examine how advocacy is sometimes mistaken for activism as well. And that is kind of the boundaries have been blurred. But I wanted to just say that maybe there's a way forward in actually knowing more about the science and theory of race and racism, which I think that people sometimes don't understand. I think there is a misunderstanding or maybe a misconception or ignorance about how racism really manifests, or why racism is still present. And if we look back and think about how race actually started, unless we understand why race came about and how race came about, how the notion of race was constructed, and how racism has then progressed or has been used by people. Maybe perhaps that is a way forward as well, maybe more discussion and discourse about it. But also I think the notion of intersectionality can be used to create these kind of non-judgmental discourses where there is less defensiveness. So even when we talk about privilege, or even when we talk about bias, if we talk in terms of intersectionality, that actually everybody is biased, everybody has privilege, but it's different levels of different kinds of privilege, and that determines your status and position in the society and hierarchy, maybe that can be a way forward as well.
Thank you, Pragya. So Monica, talked about we are stuck, we are exhausted. Pragya sort of, is telling us that we need a better understanding. So Kahinde, what is the way forward here? Right? How do we get out of this, place where we seem to be stuck and we are tired? And so because movements need to understand things better, obviously, but they also need to have a strategy. Right? What does that strategy need to look like?
I mean, the key thing is to stop expecting things from the state. I mean, honestly, I'm not frustrated or upset at all. I'm actually kind of find it quite funny. I mean, it's so bad, it's amusing. I never expected anything different. And what else would you want? And I think this is a reminder that we just need to stop expecting things from the institutions and start to build our own institutions. And I think if you look at the UK, the British Black Power movement historically was about the schools don't work, so we're going to do Saturday schools. We need employment, so we'll create employment. And there was this moment where, because we thought we could get into the system and fix the system, we kind of took our eye off that grassroots organization. That's always been, this system is against us. The system is deeply racist, and there's no solution to racism within the system. So what we should do is build alternatives. Remember that there is other ways to organize the world. Like, it doesn't have to be this way. And so really what we should be thinking about is, how do we make the global connections necessary to build alternatives to a system that's not going to get us anywhere, whether that is Latin America, whether that is Africa, whether it is UK or Europe. That's what we should be doing. And again, hopefully, this is just a really good reminder that that's the task we should be doing.
What does that alternative look like? And are there any precedents that the movement can actually learn from?
But yeah, I mean, I think this is, again, like 50 years ago, if I was here saying we need revolution, global revolution, the Black Revolution, that's a real thing. Like, that was a thing. Like, it wasn't that long ago that they wasn't sure the West would survive. So you have Pan-African movements, you have certainly Pan-Latin American movements. There were movements around this. They would have saw people were killed off, bought off, etc. There's lots of precedent to that. And then that's where we should go back. Essentially, it has to be a simple answer: is let's go back to that time and try to rebuild those movements. And if we do that in 50 years, we'll be in a very, very different place.
Okay, Ali, you want to add anything to what Kahinde just said?
Maybe just a sentence or two, because I think I agree with it, and that's where the positivity did come from in terms of the protest, was that there was a hint that we were trying to at least engage, if not return to some of those earlier traditions, right? And I guess just one sentence I want to add is that line from Bob Marley when he's talking about, the end of the aim of anti-racism is to make someone's skin color not matter more than the color of their eyes, right? So actually, what we need to really engage with is the abolition of race. Making race not matter anymore in social realities, because it was a thing that was made, right? So now we need to get rid of it. So what would the world look like? It's like what Kahinde said, it would be a completely different place, because many of our taken for granted categories of existence would no longer even exist, let alone all of the political economies that have been built around it.
Right. So we have questions coming in, and since we have so many people, I think we should try to answer as many questions as possible. And some of these are along the lines of what we are discussing. Because like one person is asking, I'm so tired of fighting racism. What still gives you hope? So you guys are talking about this alternate, and but are we any closer to that? I mean, I come back to my original question, what does the movement need to do in order to get closer to that? So maybe I can start with Monica and well, let me come to Monica. Yes, Monica.
Well, I think combating these feelings of hopelessness and discouragement is the first thing, because that is exactly what oppression does to us. It makes us feel that there's no solution, that there's nothing we can do, that we should just give up. And I'm not going to give up. This is the job I want to do, and I actually do it with a lot of happiness, because I am in a one hand, at the same time that it breaks my heart every time that I encounter these issues, it's a really interesting challenge to me. So how
It's
can
called
I
different
do it?
opinions.
You know, how can I
If
do
you
it?
have
The
five
same things that
panelists that
I've
agree,
kind of
then
have taken me to
you know.
academia, which is how do we know what we know? Now I'm really thinking of that question. Okay, so if that doesn't work, what can work? You know, how can it work? And I think one big piece of this whole problem is that, from my perspective, we
The
really
reason
need
you
to
don't like what he's
connect
saying is
dots
because what he
between,
says challenges you the most.
I would
That
say,
would
what
be
are the emotional
the
effects of oppression
best
in
way
each
to respond
individual and
to
each
that.
collective, and the
Whenever
big
people say
structural
things that you really
changes
don't like, they
and
challenge you
challenges.
more than anyone
There's
else.
somewhere where we get stuck individually and collectively. We get
It's easy to
angry,
listen
we
to
get
people
upset,
you
we
agree
are
with.
traumatized, we are furious because somebody's telling us, you know, we
Well,
can't
that's your
have it
perspective
our
right now.
way, or
But you
we
might think
are
about what he said, and
believing
you
that
might realise that he had some
advantage
interesting
and
points.
privilege are really good, you know, good for us, and we are just so like we want to protect it in many different ways. So
I mean, I
I
get his
think there's
feeling.
somewhere there's a piece
I
about
really
that
do.
where we need to deal with those emotional effects of racism and of oppression in general. What racism does to each person, sexism, classism, all of these make a way for us to stop fighting, you know, not only fighting, to stop getting up, to stop thinking again of new things. I want us to think that this is an interesting challenge, you know. I'm not saying that it's fun, because it's not necessarily fun in that haha way, but it is interesting to find ways. Why are we so stuck when actually racism, equally as sexism and environmental catastrophe, is not good for anybody? You know, there is a problem here where if we keep understanding racism as something that happens to others and not as this dehumanizing process that confuses us about who we are and who collectivities and other people are, we're just getting stuck, you know. So I think we need to kind of, that's what gives me hope, you know, to kind of go back and do those connections between the individual and the structural, and think about those ways in much more fluid, you know. Think about how can I really talk to someone and tell them, you know, someone that supposedly is privileged, and say to them, look, have you seen what this dehumanizing work has done to you? Do you want that? Is that really, you know? So I think, anyway, there are different ways in which we can think about it, and keeping in mind what racism does.
I'm just trying to sort of, you know, I mean, think through, okay, how we manage to do these things, right? But right now I have an interesting question for Pragya, and this is all Kahinde's fault, because our questioner is asking, you know, Kahinde has asserted that this is the most racist government in recent history. Where is the evidence for that?
Well, I am an immigrant to this country. I came here 20 years ago, so I haven't really experienced all the governments. But from what history tells me, or from what I read from history, is that partisan politics is on the rise everywhere. I think the notion of fear and mistrust is being used not just in the UK, but everywhere around the world. We are seeing it in India, we are seeing it in the US. It's being used by politicians to their own benefit, to their own advantage. And I think the movement here, the right-wing movement, and also the way that the government is using the notion of race, the notion of gaslighting, the notion of dismissing people's own lived experiences, is not very dissimilar to what's happening in India or what's happened in the US as well. I think when there is fear and mistrust of people who are outsiders, which is created by politicians, like people coming in to take your jobs, or people changing your lifestyle, or people impinging on your own rights and taking up your resources. When that happens, we are more likely to fall back on these kind of prejudices that we hold against people. We are more fearful, we are more threatened, and so it's serving their purpose, really, by doing that, by dividing these lines. We've seen it in history that we saw it during the imperial rule about the divide and rule that happened. And I think it's the kind of same strategy that's been deployed again here of divide and rule. So, so that's what I think.
Okay. Thanks, Pragya. Let me bring it back to Kahinde, because he started this, and Kahinde, I mean, if we believe you that this is the most racist government, my question to you would be, why is that so?
I would say, clarify, say one of the most. I mean, Britain has a lot of races. It's not like it's not an outlier in many ways, and certainly in recent history. But if you actually look at the platform of this government, in terms of immigration, in terms of Britishness, in terms of rhetorically,
I mean, the
it's not that
Windrush
dissimilar to the
thing.
National Front in the 70s. I mean, it really isn't. You could actually take a National Front poster and put it next to these ridiculous flags that all the ministers have when they go on TV. And the National Front would never have got into power in the 70s. So it's something definitely shifted where these ideas have become mainstream. I think that's a really big thing that's changed, where this kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric, and if you look at this is the most anti-immigrant policy this country has had, and that's building successively on from 60s onwards. And if you look at the Windrush scandal, etc., and even look at now, I mean, even with Priti Patel coming out saying, "Yeah, I would under my own rules, I wouldn't be here," but hey, it's still fair, right? I mean, it's a certain madness to it. But there's been a mainstreaming of really right-wing racist ideas in a way that, again, 50 years ago, they wouldn't have been mainstream. These would have been really far on the right, honestly, the stuff that they get away with. And ironically, one of the ways that's possible is because it's the most diverse government in history, right? Priti Patel says things that white people couldn't say. Let's just be 100% honest. You would not have a white Home Secretary coming out saying Black Lives Matter protests were dreadful. Never in a million years. In fact, with this report, no, if this was like David Goodhart, it would have been so much measured, and it would have been all subtle, and couldn't have had half of this stuff in it. So one of the things that has happened is because you have this diversity in the right particular, it's actually really legitimized just a load of really racist stuff because it's coming out of the faces of Black and brown people. Wow, so it is. The more I think about it, it's terrible. We're in a really bad place.
That's a very interesting assertion. I mean, Ali, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I completely agree, and it comes back to what Kahinde was actually saying at the very beginning, is that it comes down to these concessions, right? So diversity is a concession that allows for us to maintain the status quo, if not to even take it into even further extreme directions, right? So we see that now with this most diverse cabinet we've ever had, and the way that like white liberals were all going, what's the term, gooey-eyed over Rishi Sunak last summer and so on. So yeah, we see that in the UK. We've seen it in the past in the US, where one of the big concessions was all of this civil rights legislation that supposedly desegregated schools, desegregated neighborhoods, desegregated markets and jobs and so on. And yet, as people like Kimberly Crenshaw wrote, 20 years later, stuff's actually worse for us now because all of those affirmative action legislation is either used to benefit white people or is used to actually justify segregation. So it comes back to what Kahinde was saying at the beginning. Diversity is a great example of a concession that the state makes in order to just carry on doing what they were already doing.
Right. Monica, what's the role? And someone is asking, what is the role that the media has been playing in all this? Because, language has assumed a particular significance with terms like woke and wokery and so on and so forth, mocking the struggle almost. So do you have any comments on that?
Well, what can we say about the media? I mean, it is not a source of like totally reliable information, and we need to have we need to understand the positioning of each of the media outlets and take our informed view. I mean, we cannot take it as at face value, So I guess we know that, but it would be easily to get us, swayed by it and think about take it too seriously. I think it's just one more actor that is producing information, and that we should just be thinking about ourselves, about what we want to do. I mean, the recent problems that different media outlets have had, for example, with what happened with the scandal of Harry and Meghan and all these racism
well, it
going
won't
on
be.
in
What'll
the
happen
palace,
is
and some people having to resign, and it tells us
problems
that
will
it
become
is a
more
political
finite
space. It's a political
in a
space.
rippling
We are
way.
seeing it playing out with this report, how the Daily Mail is
So the
saying
way
very welcome report today,
the
whereas
state and the
other
newspapers,
outlets
i.e.
from
like
the
a few
Guardian or
controlled special interest groups essentially help make these decisions, the more it causes us, the general public, to have discourse, to do this kind of conversation. And by doing so, what we do is we create the atmosphere for actual change, because we will change as people. And because of that, we will force its institutions to change as well. There'll be outlier organisations that are ahead of the game. There'll be, like universities are usually pretty good because they have to be seen to be doing the right thing. Public institutions usually, all right. But the big changes will come because we have reached that point. But that's only because the discussion's being had on a massive scale right now. And that will cause the change. Well, I don't know.
the independent being more critical about it, or more. Yeah, so I think we just need to be mindful, that they are carriers of political positions.
So okay, there's a very interesting question, and so let me know who wants to take this question. And the question is there a substantial difference in the BLM movement in the UK compared to the US? If yes, how does that show up? Who wants to go first?
I'll just go quickly. I mean, yes, certainly BLM in the States is it's not just a movement; it's an organization, right? It has chapters, it's got funding, it's relatively well organized. BLM in the UK is more of a movement. It isn't like isn't at this point a coordinated organization. They did get a lot of money recently over the summer, but yeah, this would be a good example of how it's different. What they've largely done with that money is given it to other organizations, whereas Black Lives Matter would have used that as part of their organization. So, in movement terms, it's not, the principles are very similar, but actually, practically in organization, they are very different.
Anyone wants to add anything to that?
I would also add that they work in different racial imaginaries. I mean, the US and the UK are not the same. That's a problem that we have, that people sometimes talk about the US and the UK as if they are an extension of each other. And I think that is a mistake. They have been obviously very different racial projects, connected and interconnected in terms of racism and anti-racism, but they are very distinct. I think one thing that, of course, unites not only the US and the UK, but other places in Latin America, in other parts of the world, has to do with some of the key issues that BLM is raising. And particularly, we can just start with police brutality. And that is something that, it helps, mobilize and certain issues that are really key for any discussion on institutional racism, structural racism, and what is happening around the world, and how people of color are being treated, particularly Black people, how Black people are being treated.
There's another very interesting question, and I suppose we could even generalize this question, because the question is there a country/society where white supremacy does not have a hold anymore? And I mean, are there societies that,
of course, Chinese,
would actually be a beacon? I mean, you guys obviously don't seem to have much faith in the report that was released today. So, are there beacons, Pragya?
I would say that white supremacy exists in one form or the other everywhere, because that's how our society has structured. That's the history, the legacy of imperialism, colonialism, slavery. So even in coming from South Asia, for instance, from an Indian context, I say white supremacy exists still in the notion of colorism there, because this proximity to whiteness is still considered better for people. It's still, people are assigned a higher status in society if they're fair skinned, if they're white skinned, and it's a deeply rooted problem in society. So even in countries where whiteness is not the predominant demographic, it's still that legacy has been left behind, in the way that the what we read, what we see,
Hope you
it's
don't
all
mind. I've
shaped
just
by
tweeted the
white
Chinese
supremacy,
embassy in
I
the
think.
UK to let
So
them know
Are there any
your
societies,
thoughts,
countries that
because I
are in
like
a better
trolling them.
place
Been
that
trolling
one
them
can
for a little while now.
look up to? Or is it the same all over?
North Pole, maybe? I don't know.
I think I would go with this idea of white supremacy. Charles Mills has this great quote of white supremacy as the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. So, it's impossible to talk about anywhere being beyond white supremacy because the whole point is that it captures the entire world system, right? So you can't think about, I don't know, Uyghur concentration camps in China without thinking about how the very discourse of Islamophobia itself is rooted in that Western tradition of modernity. You can't think about Hindutva in India without thinking about how, the very reification of the caste system was really bolstered by British colonialists, right? You can't think about how Bolsonaro's project in Brazil is manufactured without thinking about how he wants to present this picture of Portugal as this amazing beacon of knowledge where Brazil is the best creation of Portugal. And all of those enslaved people came to Brazil not because of the Portuguese, but because of African people themselves, right? So all of these bring us back to white supremacy as this unnamed political system, even in societies where white people are not necessarily the demographic majority.
Right. So maybe, two of you have been talking about decolonization because we seem to be coming back to this dominant transnational discourse that seems to be quite deeply rooted all over. And so, and two of you at least, and probably, the other two as well. But you are co-chair of Decolonizing Society in your departments. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you are trying to do that.
Bolsonaro runs close second.
I think I let Ali start with that.
Okay, Ali.
Sure. Yes. So it's and it kind of relates to one of the questions someone asked. Someone asked a question about white perspectives on history or something, and it relates also to the report today, which basically suggests that decolonizing the curriculum involves just basically getting rid of white races. The issue with decolonizing is to show how colonialism, imperialism, empire, the construction of race, how they were all formative processes, essential processes in the making of the modern world, right? So the world would not look as it looks like now if it weren't for all of those things that happened and that continue to shape contemporary power relations. So my one thought that I would share is that the issue is really about going beyond bifurcated understandings of histories towards connected understandings of histories, right? So if you think about British industrialization, because the report that came out today basically said, oh, we need to, give a positive vision of Britain's past. Well, if you think about British industrialization and how Britain became modern, one of the kind of success stories is cotton and the cotton industry. But the majority of that cotton was taken from the labor of the enslaved in the US. And then the majority of that was then exported from Britain to the colonies, particularly to India, where they would plummet those markets, right? So you can't really think about British modernity and British industrialization without thinking about the links to enslavement and colonialism simultaneously. You can't think about the very existence, for example, of the Nazi Party and the Holocaust and Nazism and European fascism, which we are all taught about in schools, without thinking about how Hitler used the genocide of indigenous Americans, how he used British tactics that they used in the Boer concentration camps, how he took tactics from the Spanish colonization of Latin America with shooting sprees and forced starvations. You can't really understand the very logic of European fascism without understanding how itself was derivative of European colonialism.
For sure.
So what we're trying to do with decolonizing is to show how what we're trying to create is not removing bits of history and removing bits of our understanding of societies and histories, but really to improve them by forging these connections that exist. And these connections that were absolutely necessary to the stuff that we do learn about, but that we learn about in incredibly bifurcated manners.
A million Mau Mau were interned concentration camps
because the Mau Mau didn't exist.
Also a question here
how do you balance how useful it is to take part in European Enlightenment ideals in order for society to flourish with the anti-racist animosity towards it? Who wants to have a go?
Sorry, what was the question again?
So it's in the chat. How do you balance how useful it is to take part in European Enlightenment ideals in order for society to flourish with the anti-racist animosity towards it? So
that's pretty easy. You just abandon the ridiculous conception that European Enlightenment ideals are necessary for society to function, and then we can move on from there. I think.
Right. Okay. That's easily done. Now, there's another question about the term BAME. Right? Where do you guys stand on that? Because this is also something that the report brings up, and they want to completely, outlaw the use of this term.
So I suppose I've said a lot about these terms that we use and how that homogenizes people and how that centers whiteness. And basically it's saying there's white and there's non-white. So again, you kind of lumping everybody who's not considered white in one group and not disaggregating the data to show that actually within these communities there's diversity, within these communities there are different barriers to and different kinds of oppression, different histories, different legacies. And I think that term has been used to kind of tokenize diversity in a lot of organizations, because just by saying, oh, we've got 25% BME, and so we can tick that box that we've got diversity, but that might mean that within the BME date, this label, the different communities, there might not be much diversity. So we're not really considering that different communities face different levels of oppression and barriers and discrimination. So I think in that way, it's a really useful thing to talk about, that these terms are really harmful. So any terms like that, people of color or BIPOC that's used in the USA, most of these terms are homogenizing people. And what we need is to desegregate data. What we need is to individuate people as much as possible. But we do need some term, because what can happen and what might happen with this government is that by removing the term altogether, even the issues related to the term can be erased as well. So that is something that we need to be careful about, whether by removing the term, what are we hoping to achieve? What is this government going to do next if this term is being removed? Is it going to erase people's experience, lived experience? Is it going to erase the issues, the barriers that people face because of belonging to a cohort like that or being in the minority? So I think we need to examine these terms, but we need to disaggregate the data as much as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pragya. Yes, a quick word, because we are less than a minute away, Monica.
Yeah, well, I would say that we need to move away from identity-based understandings to processes, to think about oppression, to think about racism, to think about injustice, inequality, rather than, the naming of the identities. Therefore, that we can do better work at understanding what's going on for whom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me thank you all. I think your verdict is very clear on whether anything has changed or not as a result of BLM so far. But I do see some hope that, okay, this is just a counter mobilization. This is just a backlash, and the movement will just have to up its game, and there will need to be cross-national action across countries. And with this report out, I think, this conversation and this movement is likely to continue for a while. So thank you very much, everyone, again. And I hope to see you again